Hey guys, tonight we step into the haunting silence of St. Mary's Convent, where the last days of a tranquil community would take a dark and inexplicable turn. Nestled in the hills, far from the bustling world, the convent stood as a place of peace, devotion, and spiritual contemplation. You probably won't survive this, though you might find yourself looking over your shoulder next time you pass a quiet, secluded building in the middle of nowhere. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels tonight. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins in a place you might think was free of turmoil, a place where silence reigned, where the only voices you'd hear were whispers of prayer. St. Mary's Convent was tucked away in the remote countryside, an idyllic setting far removed from the noise of the modern world. If you've ever seen a photo of a convent surrounded by tall trees, ivy creeping along the walls, you probably imagine something that exudes serenity. But beneath this calm exterior, something far darker was taking place. It was a cold winter's night, the kind that chills you straight to the bone, when everything went quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet where you feel your heartbeat echoing in your ears, and every creak of the floorboards sounds like an omen. This wasn't the stillness of peace. It was the stillness of something gone terribly wrong. The first sign came when the bell, which normally chimed at every hour of the day and night, failed to ring. To the outsiders, it might have seemed like nothing more than an unfortunate mechanical failure. But for the sisters inside, the bell was sacred, a constant reminder of their duties. When it didn't ring that night, it was a harbinger of something far worse. But the real nightmare began the next morning. When no one could find the nuns, historians still argue whether the disappearance of the nuns was a singular event or part of a disturbing pattern that had been unfolding for decades. The eerie silence that engulfed St. Mary's was no accident. It was as if the very walls themselves were closing in on the inhabitants. Even now, decades later, no one can quite explain what happened to the women who had lived so devotedly in their secluded world. Some claim the disappearances were the result of a broken system, a place where rules and rituals were taken too far. Others whisper of something darker, something more sinister, hiding in the shadows. As you walk through the empty halls of the convent in your mind's eye, you can almost feel the weight of it all. The faded prayers scrawled on the walls, the quiet footsteps echoing down long, sterile corridors. All of it speaks to a time now lost. The silence, you realize, isn't merely the absence of sound, but the absence of those who once filled it. What happened to the women who vanished that night? Was it an escape, a tragedy, or something far worse? Now, dim the lights even lower and listen closely, because this is where the story takes a chilling turn. The nuns of St. Mary's had long been accustomed to a life of silence and devotion. Their world, sealed off from the outside, was built on a rigid routine, one that focused entirely on prayer, discipline, and ritual. From the moment the sun rose to the moment it set, each of them adhered to a strict schedule that, on the surface, seemed peaceful and serene. But beneath the tranquility, there was a hidden tension, a quiet sense that something was not quite right. The nuns wore their habits like armor, not only as a sign of their faith, but as a reminder of their deep commitment to a life of sacrifice. They woke early each morning to the toll of the convent bell, a sound that seemed to echo through the very bones of the building. It marked the beginning of their day, which always started with hours of prayer in the dimly lit chapel, a place where the flickering candles cast long shadows on the stone walls. The smell of incense would hang in the air, adding to the sense of ritualistic reverence. Once prayers were over, the nuns would gather for breakfast, a simple meal of bread and water. The days were filled with duties, from tending to the gardens and preparing meals for the local poor to cleaning the vast, sprawling convent. Time was marked not by the hours on a clock, but by the natural rhythms of the earth and the chimes of the bell. Historians still argue whether such extreme devotion, coupled with isolation, can ever remain truly healthy. Some say the rigidity of their lifestyle was what bound them to a life of contentment, while others claim it trapped them in a cycle of unending obedience, stifling any form of personal expression or freedom. Could the convent's strict rules have pushed the nuns too far, making them yearn for a life outside the walls that confined them? Was there more to their silence than just prayer? There were whispers among the locals, though they rarely dared to speak them aloud, that the convent's seclusion was not as peaceful as it seemed. A few people who had once visited the nuns, whether for charity or to deliver supplies, had reported strange occurrences. The sound of footsteps in the halls at night, when no one should have been walking, shadows in the windows when the convent was supposed to be empty, and, more troubling, the nuns themselves seemed increasingly withdrawn, their once bright faces now clouded with sorrow or fear. Despite the rumors, the local community still revered the convent. To them, it was a symbol of faith and piety. But even the most devoted parishioners could not ignore the occasional whispers of unrest that seemed to creep out of St. Mary's like a slow leak of something poisonous. In the evening, when the work of the day was done and the nuns would retire to their cells for the night, the atmosphere grew heavier. The rooms were sparse, with only the basics: a bed, a small wooden table, a candle. Yet, the air inside those rooms always felt thick with the weight of unspoken words. Some nuns, especially the younger ones, would lay awake at night, unable to sleep, listening to the sounds of the convent, the creaking of the old wooden floors, the distant whispers of others, the strange rustling in the shadows. There were nights when even the air felt charged, as if something unseen was moving within the very walls themselves. It wasn't uncommon for them to find strange marks on their bedding in the morning deep, almost unnatural scratches, as if something had clawed at them in the night. But when they spoke of it, the older nuns would dismiss their fears, telling them that the devil often whispered in the ears of the faithful, trying to lure them away from their devotions. Still, it wasn't enough to quell the growing unease. You could sense it in the air. Something had shifted. Perhaps it was the years of isolation, or perhaps it was something darker, something older. Historians argue that this kind of oppressive environment, built on the back of total submission, can lead to disillusionment. Was there something festering beneath the surface? Was the convent truly a place of holiness? Or was it a cage, built on rituals and prayers that ultimately served to obscure deeper truths, regardless of the cause? the day the bell failed to ring, marking the beginning of the end. The convent's silence had taken on a different meaning altogether, and that silence, it spoke louder than any prayer. The eerie silence that had settled over St. Mary's Convent didn't just come out of nowhere. For years, there had been hushed rumors, disjointed whispers about past tragedies, unsettling events, and even strange disappearances that didn't make the official records. These were not the stories of holy women living in peaceful seclusion. No, these were tales of women who had been lost in the folds of history, buried beneath layers of silence that the convent itself had maintained, almost as if it were trying to erase its own past. The first signs of something truly wrong began long before the nuns disappeared. It started with small details unnoticed at first, but growing in significance the longer you looked. There were stories that had trickled down from the oldest of the nuns, those who had served in the convent for decades, their faces like maps of the past. They would speak in low, gravelly voices about things that seemed impossible to verify. One of the more persistent rumors was about a nun named Sister Marie, who had gone missing almost 30 years before. She wasn't the first, and certainly not the last. But her disappearance had been particularly strange. No one knew where she had gone. But there were whispers that Sister Marie had been seen late one night standing in the chapel, staring at the altar with eyes wide open. The next morning, she was simply gone. At first, because the nuns chalked it up to her mental state. Maybe she had been overwhelmed by the isolation. Or perhaps the spiritual weight had finally taken its toll. But when another nun, a younger one, went missing just a few years later, things started to seem. And when the local authorities were called in, they found nothing. No signs of struggle, no clues, no evidence to explain where the women had gone. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Historians still argue whether these disappearances were isolated incidents or part of a larger pattern of what could be described as a disturbing cycle. Some claim these women were simply seeking escape from a life that had become unbearable. But others, more skeptically, ask if something more sinister was at play, perhaps something tied to the very foundations of the convent. Could the convent itself have been hiding something darker than anyone realized? One particularly chilling story that had circulated among the locals involved the crypt beneath the convent. Some claimed that the crypt had been a place of unspeakable rituals long before the nuns ever arrived, that it had once been used for secret ceremonies, the kind of ceremonies that were meant to summon forces beyond human understanding. The fact that the crypt was still sealed, its entrance concealed by a labyrinth of passages, only added fuel to the fire. Now, don't let your mind wander too much. But if you were one of the young nuns who arrived at St. Mary's with hopes of serving God in peace, you'd probably be warned to stay away from certain parts of the convent. The older nuns, those who had been there for years, would give you quick glances as they ushered you away from certain corridors and kept the conversation light when you inquired about the crypt. In fact, there were reports from the newer nuns about strange dreams they'd had, dreams where they would hear voices coming from beneath the convent, beckoning them to come closer, to listen. They spoke of the crypt like it was a living entity, something ancient and terrible, waiting to be discovered. The more the new nuns tried to dismiss these tales, the more unsettled they became. These whispers about the crypt seemed to be the one thing that everyone agreed upon. Was it merely superstition, a collection of old legends meant to scare the newcomers into submission, or was there something deeper, a threat that was bound to resurface if the wrong person uncovered the truth? Historians still argue about the existence of this crypt. Was it simply a figment of the nuns' imagination, a myth designed to reinforce fear? Or did it really hold something that had been buried long ago? Waiting to awaken, the silence surrounding the crypt only made it more terrifying. Some say the truth is hidden in the walls of St. Mary's, and that the convent itself had become an unwitting guardian of a terrible secret. But no one could have predicted what would happen next, the moment when the nuns would disappear once again. But this time, leaving behind nothing but shadows and unanswered questions. The church's silence on the matter only deepened the mystery, casting doubt on everything that had come before. The night everything changed was the night the bell didn't ring. The first sign that something was off came just after dusk, when the nuns gathered for their evening prayer. The chapel, which was always bathed in a warm, golden light from the candles lining the pews, felt unusually cold. For a brief moment, the silence inside the chapel felt heavier than usual, thick with an oppressive stillness. It was as if the very air had been tainted by something invisible. The bell, normally a comforting reminder of the passing hours, failed to toll. At first, the nuns shrugged it off. It was winter, after all, and sometimes the cold would cause the mechanisms to freeze. But as the evening dragged on, it became apparent that the bell wasn't going to ring. The stillness inside the convent deepened, stretching into uncomfortable silence. Historians still argue whether the missing bell was a simple mechanical failure or if it was a symbolic sign, something much larger at play. Could the failure of such an important ritual mark the beginning of something ominous, or was it just a coincidence that the bell stopped ringing on the very night that would alter the course of St. Mary's history forever? As the hours passed and the cold crept deeper into the stone walls, the nuns retired to their cells for the night, still without the comforting sound of the bell to guide them. But that night, unlike any other, was different. They lay awake, each of them in their sparse little rooms, feeling an unsettling sense of foreboding in the air. No one could shake the feeling that something was coming, something they weren't prepared for. In the dead of night, one of the youngest nuns, Sister Agnes, heard something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A soft whisper, barely audible, but distinct. It seemed to come from the chapel, a place where no one should have been at that hour. She had heard these whispers before, faint murmurs that she could never quite understand. But this time, the words seemed clearer, almost urgent. She slowly stood from her bed and made her way down the long, dark corridors, her footsteps muffled by the heavy silence. When she reached the chapel, she found it empty, save for the faint glow of a single candle flickering in the distance. She had expected to see a figure, perhaps one of the older nuns, praying in solitude as was customary. But no one was there. Only the candle, its flame flickering like a dying star. The unease she felt that night only grew stronger when she returned to her cell and found that her belongings had been disturbed. Her things had been moved: books, rosaries, and small trinkets that she kept for comfort. It was as if someone had been in her room, though she was certain no one had entered. The other nuns didn't notice anything unusual, but Sister Agnes couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something unseen was lurking within the convent. The very fabric of the place seemed to be unraveling. As the hours passed, the nuns continued their routines. But by morning, something had changed. One by one, the sisters discovered that several of their fellow nuns had disappeared during the night. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no evidence of anything sinister. They had simply vanished, leaving no trace behind. The authorities were immediately alerted, but when they arrived at the convent, they found only confusion and fear. The search began quickly, but as they combed the grounds, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. The nuns were gone, but their absence wasn't the only mystery. There were signs that someone or something had been inside the convent. Footprints in the dust, strange markings on the walls, and the faint scent of incense that seemed to linger in the air, even though the candles had been blown out hours before. The community was in shock. How could this happen? The convent was a place of peace, of devotion. How could something like this unfold in such a sacred space? Historians still argue whether the disappearances were the result of some great evil, perhaps a long-buried force that had been awakened, or if the nuns had, for some inexplicable reason, left the convent on their own accord. Some believe they fled, desperate to escape a life of isolation and fear, while others insist there was something far more sinister at play. As the days turned into weeks, and the search efforts continued to come up empty, the community began to turn inward. They were no longer asking, where did they go? But rather, what happened to them? And as the answers remained elusive, the eerie silence of St. Mary's convent only deepened. The search for the missing nuns of St. Mary's convent seemed endless, but each day that passed only deepened the mystery. The authorities, initially hopeful that the nuns might have simply wandered off, soon realized there were no simple explanations to be found. Each search turned up more unsettling details that painted a far darker picture. No footprints led away from the convent, and there were no signs of a struggle. It was as if the nuns had evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only questions and confusion. As the investigation progressed, local detectives and members of the community began to ask themselves, how could so many women devoted, faithful nuns disappear without a trace? It didn't make sense. The police were thorough in their search. They combed the convent's grounds, checked the crypts and hidden passages beneath the convent, and questioned the remaining sisters who hadn't disappeared. But no one could provide any answers. The remaining nuns, though obviously frightened, insisted they had no knowledge of the missing women's whereabouts. They, too, seemed to be in the dark. Historians still argue whether the lack of evidence meant the nuns had truly disappeared without a trace, or if the convent's deep-rooted secrecy had worked in their favor. Perhaps there were hidden tunnels beneath the convent, or perhaps someone had known more about the nuns' fate than they were willing to admit. The local community began to turn to superstition, as they always did in the face of the inexplicable. Many began to whisper about the strange occurrences that had long plagued the convent, speculating that the nuns had fallen victim to some ancient curse. The crypt beneath the convent, once thought to be just a relic of the past, was now at the center of these whispers. Could it hold the answers to the mystery? Was there some force waiting to claim the souls of the devout? While the search continued, a few determined individuals began to seek answers on their own. Among them was a local historian named Thomas Whitaker, who had spent years researching the convent's history. He had always been intrigued by the strange stories surrounding St. Mary's, particularly the older nuns' reluctance to speak of its past. He had heard rumors about a secret, ancient society that had once held sway over the convent, and now, more than ever, he was determined to uncover the truth. Whitaker's investigation led him down a path of discovery that was as disturbing as it was eye-opening. The deeper he dug into the convent's history, the more he uncovered about the institution's founding. St. Mary's Convent was built on land that had long been rumored to be cursed. The property had originally been owned by an eccentric nobleman named Edmund Blackwood, a man known for his interest in the occult and dark practices. Though Blackwood had been a devout Catholic, he was also a man of peculiar habits, and it was rumored that he had used his wealth to fund secret rituals and gatherings that many believed were intended to summon forces beyond human comprehension. Was Blackwood's obsession with the occult somehow connected to the disappearances? Could the convent, built on his land, be cursed by his dark interests? Whitaker wasn't sure, but the more he learned, the more unsettling the answers seemed to become. One particularly chilling discovery was a series of journals written by Blackwood himself. These journals detailed strange, cryptic entries about rituals conducted on the grounds of what would eventually become St. Mary's. The most disturbing part of these records were the mentions of a hidden chamber beneath the convent, a place that Blackwood referred to as the Sanctuary of Shadows. According to the journals, this sanctuary was where he performed his most secretive and dangerous rituals. As Whitaker continued to piece together the story, he found more and more references to the Sanctuary of Shadows. It was said to be hidden from the eyes of the nuns, a place they would never be allowed to enter. And yet, many of the older nuns had hinted at its existence. Some even suggested that the younger nuns had been chosen to partake in the rituals. Could this secret chamber hold the key to understanding the strange events unfolding at St. Mary's? Historians still debate whether Blackwood's occult practices had any lasting impact on the convent. Was there something more than coincidence that tied the convent's history to these dark rituals? Or were these stories simply the musings of a bygone era, long forgotten and irrelevant? While Whitaker continued his investigation, the local police began to consider other, more practical explanations. They spoke to several former nuns who had left the convent over the years, hoping that someone might know something that could help solve the mystery. These former sisters revealed a few unsettling details, such as the fact that some of the nuns had begun to act strangely before their disappearance. They spoke of feelings of unease, of hearing voices at night, and of experiencing disturbing visions during their prayers. Could these visions have been the result of long-term isolation? Or was there something else at work, something that no one was willing to acknowledge? The search for the missing nuns, it seemed, was becoming a journey into the very heart of St. Mary's dark secrets. The deeper the authorities and investigators dug, the more tangled the web became, and the more they uncovered, the more they realized that the mystery was far from over. As the investigation dragged on, more strange and unsettling discoveries were made, but none of them brought the authorities any closer to the truth. The crypt beneath the convent, long forgotten by most, was reopened. It had been sealed for decades, its existence almost an afterthought to the daily life of the nuns. But when it was opened, it revealed a chilling sight. The walls of the crypt were lined with old, faded symbols, ancient markings that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, as if they had been placed there for a purpose far beyond simple religious reverence. These symbols, as Whitaker would later discover, were remarkably similar to those found in Blackwood's journals, where they were described as part of an occult ritual that was meant to channel the dark forces he believed lay dormant beneath the earth. But what had Blackwood intended with these rituals? What had he hoped to achieve by summoning forces beyond human understanding? Despite the grim discovery in the crypt, there was still no clear evidence linking Blackwood to the nuns' disappearances. But what they did uncover was something far more sinister, something that no one could have predicted. Hidden deep within the convent's walls was a set of old, dusty records. These weren't the typical records kept by the convent, no. These were much darker. The documents contained a list of names, nuns who had entered St. Mary's over the years, each one marked with a mysterious symbol beside their name. The list seemed to stretch on for decades, spanning back to the very founding of the convent. Each name was carefully written in a neat, almost obsessive hand. Some of the names were crossed out, others highlighted in ink. But what caught the attention of the investigators were the dates. According to the records, a large number of nuns had disappeared from the convent, their names crossed off and replaced by blank spaces. The last entry on the list was a name that sent chills down the spines of those who saw it: Sister Agnes. The fact that Agnes, one of the youngest and most beloved of the nuns, was listed among the names of the disappeared sent shockwaves through the community. The thought that one of their own, someone who had been present in the convent during the most recent disappearances, had been part of a much larger, long-running mystery was enough to send anyone into a state of disbelief. Historians still argue over the significance of this list. Some claim it was just a record of administrative errors, a simple clerical oversight. Others suggest that the missing names could be part of a larger conspiracy, one that had been hidden behind the walls of St. Mary's for centuries. But no one could deny the truth that was emerging. The disappearances weren't isolated incidents. They were part of something much darker, something that had been happening for generations. And the more the investigators uncovered, the more they realized that they were standing at the edge of a truth that had been buried for far too long. In the days that followed, Whitaker continued to piece together the puzzle. He began to connect the dots between the strange symbols in the crypt, the ritualistic practices described in Blackwood's journals, and the list of missing nuns. Each piece seemed to fit together in a way that suggested something chilling. The convent had been hiding its darkest secrets for centuries, and the nuns who had vanished weren't just victims of circumstance, they were part of a pattern, part of a much larger and much older ritual. The more Whitaker learned, the more he came to believe that the convent itself might be part of something far more disturbing. Was St. Mary's truly a place of worship? Or was it a cover for something darker? Had Blackwood used his wealth and influence to establish a secret order within the convent? An order whose purpose was to appease forces beyond comprehension? Could the rituals performed in the crypt have played a role in the disappearances? As Whitaker delved deeper, he uncovered a history of rituals that involved the nuns' rituals that weren't part of the church's teachings. but rather secret rites that had been passed down through generations. The crypt had been a place for these ceremonies, a place where the nuns had participated in dark acts, believing that they were serving a higher power. But what if they had been deceived? What if they had been lured into a trap, one that they couldn't escape once they were caught? The mystery was becoming clearer, but the answers were still elusive. And as the investigation moved forward, it became apparent that there was no going back. The truth about St. Mary's Convent and its history was unfolding, and it wasn't pretty. The search for the missing nuns had turned from a desperate hunt for answers into a revelation of horrifying truths, truths that no one could have prepared for. Each piece of evidence uncovered seemed to suggest that St. Mary's Convent had been hiding far more than just the nuns' disappearances. As Whitaker continued to unravel the convent's dark secrets, the implications grew ever more chilling. The crypt, once thought to be a mere burial site for the convent's founders, had turned out to be the center of something far darker, an underground chamber where rituals were performed in an attempt to summon forces from beyond the veil. But the true extent of these rituals was only beginning to be understood. Whitaker stumbled upon a letter, hidden among Blackwood's belongings, that described in detail the purpose behind the dark ceremonies that had taken place beneath the convent. The letter, written in a language that Whitaker initially didn't recognize, was dated decades before the first nun disappeared. It detailed a pact of sorts with a mysterious entity, a pact that promised protection, wealth, and power in exchange for a most dreadful price. The letter spoke of sacrifices of blood, of life itself, and a promise that the convent would be forever bound to the entity it had summoned. Whitaker couldn't understand all of the details, but what he did understand was enough to send a chill down his spine. The convent's fate, and the fate of the missing nuns, had been sealed long before they had ever set foot there. Historians still debate the authenticity of the letter, with some suggesting it could be a fabrication or an exaggeration. Others believe it to be the key to understanding what had happened to the nuns. But one thing was clear: the convent's connection to the dark forces that had been summoned there had not only shaped its past, but its present as well. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, a chilling theory emerged. The missing nuns were not merely victims of some unfortunate event. They had been chosen, selected as part of the ritualistic process that had been established centuries earlier. The rituals performed in the crypt, which had once been hidden from the rest of the world, were now being revealed as the catalyst for the disappearances. The nuns had been unknowingly and perhaps unwillingly drawn into the web of dark forces that had been tied to the convent's very foundation. The most disturbing part of the investigation came when Whitaker began to connect the missing nuns to the crypt's long history. The symbols, the rituals, and the sacrifices. It was all too clear now. The nuns had been used as pawns in a larger, more sinister game. And as Whitaker uncovered more, he began to realize that the convent itself was not just a place of worship, it was a place of control, where the powerful had orchestrated a hidden agenda under the guise of piety. But the truth about what had happened to the nuns was more than just the story of an ancient secret. It was the story of an enduring power, a power that had never truly left the convent, but had remained dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The authorities, too, had become increasingly alarmed as they realized the full scope of the mystery. As the search for the missing nuns continued, more signs emerged that indicated something far darker was happening beneath the surface. One by one, the investigators began to encounter strange occurrences, fleeting glimpses of figures in the shadows, faint whispers on the wind, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. For the nuns who remained in the convent, the realization was just as horrifying. Their community, once a place of sanctity and peace, had been corrupted by the very forces it had once sought to escape. The convent had become a prison, its walls holding more than just secrets. They held something far more terrifying. Historians continued to debate the nature of the entity that had been summoned all those years ago. Some suggest it was a demon, others a more abstract force, an ancient power that had been given life through ritual. What was certain, however, was that the entity had a hold on the convent, on its nuns, and on its fate. It was a force that had shaped their lives, twisted their faith, and ultimately controlled their destinies. With each new discovery, Whitaker and the other investigators were left with more questions than answers. But as they dug deeper, they were forced to confront the terrifying reality. The nuns hadn't simply disappeared, they had been taken. The final revelation, though, was something that no one could have expected. After weeks of investigation, as the chilling facts began to form a terrifying picture, one final piece of the puzzle was discovered: the truth about the disappearances, the dark rituals, and the nuns' fate. It wasn't just that they had been taken, it was that they had willingly walked into the unknown, driven by something beyond their control, or perhaps their understanding. Whitaker was no longer alone in his search for answers. A group of investigators, having been drawn into the mystery by his findings, had finally pieced together a theory that explained the nuns' actions. They had discovered a hidden document deep in the convent's archives, written by a nun long before the disappearances occurred. It was a letter, dated to the early years of St. Mary's founding, and it revealed a dark pact, a pact that the nuns had unknowingly renewed with each generation. The document described how, in the earliest days of the convent, the sisters had made a desperate choice. Faced with the risk of their order being dissolved and their mission failing, they had turned to the occult, seeking power to protect their faith and community. The pact they forged wasn't just a desperate cry for help. It was an offering, a promise to the ancient force that had been awakened by their prayers. This pact, it seemed, bound the convent to something far darker than any of the nuns had understood. The final sentence of the letter sent chills down Whitaker's spine. We give ourselves to the shadows, for in them we shall find strength. What had begun as a search for the missing nuns had turned into the discovery of something far worse. The entity they had unwittingly entered into a pact with had promised them protection, longevity, and even success, but it demanded a sacrifice. This cycle of ritualistic acts, each one growing darker and more dangerous as time passed, had continued unchecked for generations. But the nuns hadn't just disappeared because of the pact. No, they had vanished because they had fulfilled their part of the bargain. The entity, which had once provided the convent with its strength, was now claiming its due. It had come for those who were marked, those who had been chosen. Whitaker, along with the remaining investigators, now understood the full scope of what had happened. The missing nuns hadn't simply escaped, they had been called to answer the entity's demand. It wasn't that they had vanished into thin air. It was that they had been claimed by the very force that had bound the convent to its dark past. The chilling reality of this discovery left Whitaker and the others with more questions than answers. How many generations of nuns had been lost in this way? How deep did the pact go? And what would become of those who remained at St. Mary's? As the community came to grips with the truth, the convent was abandoned. The doors were locked, the windows shuttered, and the silence that had once been so peaceful now seemed oppressive, like the stillness of a graveyard. There were no more whispers, no more footsteps echoing in the halls, only the lingering fear of what had happened. Historians still argue about the fate of the nuns who had disappeared. Some claim they were victims of an insidious force beyond their control, while others suggest they had willingly walked into darkness, their faith leading them to make a choice that sealed their fate. In the end, no one could say for certain what had happened to those lost women. Their names were erased from history, their stories untold. But their disappearance was a warning to all who would listen, that sometimes the silence of a place holds more than just peace. It can hold the echoes of the past, a past that refuses to stay buried. And as for the convent itself, it stands now, empty, waiting. The shadows that once whispered through its halls are silent, but perhaps they are only waiting for the next generation of nuns to arrive. Perhaps the cycle will continue, as it has for centuries, until the shadows claim their due once again. As you sit here now, thinking of St. Mary's and its dark history, you might wonder, was it the nuns who were lost? Or was it the convent itself, after all? Some places are more than just buildings. They are repositories of secrets, waiting for the right moment to reveal their truth.